What if the worst thing a Hollywood actor could do wasn't flub a line or bomb at the box office? What if the worst thing was something far more personal? Something they couldn't change no matter how hard they tried. Here's the dirty secret old Hollywood never wanted you to know. Being too Jewish, too real, too unwilling to disappear. These 15 actors committed the ultimate sin. Number 15. Sylvia Sydney. Let's start with a woman Hollywood loved to push to the edge of the frame. Not villain, not heroine, just close to trouble. Sylvia Sydney. Born Sophia Kosow. A Jewish name that meant nothing to studio heads. They changed it fast, simple, clean. But here's her crime. She never learned to sparkle the way they wanted. No conventional glamour, no safe, polished smile. On screen, she carried something guarded, something quiet and heavy. That made casting directors uncomfortable. They didn't know where to place her, so they gave her roles on the margin. Characters near disgrace. Women who felt pain without screaming. Sydney accepted them, but she never pretended to be someone else off camera. That was her mistake. She didn't perform the happy lie. When the blacklist era squeezed Hollywood, she kept working, but never broke into the top tier. Why? Because the system couldn't fully embrace a Jewish woman who refused to become a fantasy. She stayed visible, but never defined the room. Worst of all, she didn't seem to care. For old Hollywood, that was unforgivable. A presence that wouldn't shrink. A name that once meant something specific. Sylvia Sydney. Too real to be a star, too Jewish to be forgotten. Number 14. Ernst Lubitsch. Now, let's talk about a man who hid his Jewishness inside elegance. Ernst Lubitsch, born in Berlin to a Jewish family. His early German comedies were broad, loud, physically wild. Then he came to Hollywood, and something strange happened. He refined himself into a whisper. The famous Lubitsch touch, wit without weight, charm without context. Hollywood adored it. But here's the twist they ignored. That lightness was a disguise. Lubitsch took his Jewish humor and distilled it until it became invisible. No Yiddish rhythms, no immigrant pain, just perfect, sophisticated nothing. That made him the worst kind of Jewish actor. Not because he failed, but because he succeeded too well. He erased every trace of where he came from. His films feel universal because they were scrubbed clean. And he knew it. He played the game better than anyone. But in doing so, he betrayed the very specificity that made him interesting. Old Hollywood celebrated him. That's the problem. He became acceptable, palatable, a refugee who taught himself to speak inoffensive comedy. The worst sin? He didn't just hide his identity. He turned it into a magic trick. You could feel the Lubitsch touch, but you could never trace it back to Berlin, back to Jewish, back to real. Number 13. Billy Wilder. What do you do when English isn't your first language, but you write sharper dialogue than anyone born in Ohio? Billy Wilder knew. He arrived as a Jewish refugee, scared, hungry, watching everything. His early scripts needed partners to smooth out the immigrant roughness. That was his first compromise. But the real crime came later. He learned to think inside American cinema. He displaced his own displacement onto his characters. Every film about moral ambiguity, about people trapped in systems they can't control. That was his life. He just never said it out loud. Wilder is the worst because he weaponized his erasure. He made fun of the very industry that forced him to hide, and audiences laughed without knowing why. Take Some Like It Hot, a cross-dressing comedy written by a man who had to change his name, his accent, his entire rhythm to survive. That's not coincidence, that's revenge. But he served it cold. Too subtle to be caught, too brilliant to be condemned. Old Hollywood gave him awards. They never gave him permission to be openly Jewish. And he never asked. He just worked. Faster, sharper, more cynical. That's the worst betrayal of all. He didn't fight the system. He outsmarted it, then made us laugh while he did it. Number 12. Zero Mostel. Now here's a man who committed the cardinal sin. He refused to cooperate. Zero Mostel, born Samuel Joel Mostel in Brooklyn. His early stage work was loud, physical, unmistakably Jewish in rhythm and fury. Hollywood noticed, but before they could fully tame him, the blacklist arrived. Mostel was called before Congress. They wanted names, they wanted submission. He gave them nothing, refused to align, refused to beg, And the system reacted exactly how you'd expect. Work vanished. Money dried up. He became unemployable. That's the worst thing a Jewish actor could do in old Hollywood. Not hide, but refuse to hide. Mostel didn't reshape himself into something palatable. He stayed loud and stubborn and broke. For years, he survived on stage work far from the cameras. Then came Fiddler on the Roof. Tevye, a role that demanded every ounce of his Jewish identity. And suddenly, the industry needed him again. But here's the ugly truth. They only welcomed him back when his Jewishness became profitable, when it could be packaged as nostalgia, not threat. Mostel accepted but never forgave. His crime? He saw the system for what it was and said no first. Old Hollywood called that difficult. We call it the worst behavior for anyone trying to fit in. He didn't fit, and that made him dangerous. Number 11. Gene Wilder. Gene Wilder feels like a strange entry on a worst list. He was beloved, gentle, unpredictable. But that's exactly the problem. Born Jerome Silberman, Jewish family. His mother was sick for much of his childhood, and he learned to make her laugh. That pain became his comedy. Quiet, off balance, almost uncomfortable. When Hollywood found him, they didn't ask about his background. They just saw a unique voice, so they let him keep it. But they never labeled it. Never said this humor comes from a Jewish son trying to ease his mother's suffering. They made it abstract, individual, almost alien. Wilder's worst sin was that he didn't push back. He changed his name like everyone else. He performed brilliance without demanding context. The Jewishness was there in every hesitant pause, in every emotional shift. But it was never named, so audiences absorbed it without understanding it. That's the quietest form of erasure. Not violent deletion, just gentle redirection. Wilder kept his soul intact, but allowed the industry to present him as a quirky oddity. Not a Jewish man, not a son of immigrants, just Gene. He's on this list because he was too good at making us forget to ask where he came from. Number 10. Danny Kaye. Speed. That's what people notice first about Danny Kaye, the way he could twist words and languages and rhythms without breaking a sweat. It looked spontaneous, like magic. It wasn't. He was born David Daniel Kaminsky, son of Jewish immigrants. His early training happened in spaces that celebrated specificity. Vaudeville, multilingual stages, crowds who got the jokes because they shared the culture. Then Hollywood arrived, and suddenly the context vanished. Kaye kept the speed, but he dropped the references. His routines became about cleverness, not origin. The energy stayed, but the identity behind it faded. That's his crime. He translated himself into a universal product. He didn't fight the narrowing. He refined his act until it could travel anywhere without raising questions. Off-screen, he stayed connected to Jewish causes, UNICEF, charity. But on screen, nothing specific, just a fast-talking man with no past. Hollywood loved him for that. He was the worst because he made erasure look effortless. You can watch his films today and never guess he grew up speaking Yiddish, never feel the weight of immigration. That's not adaptation. That's surrender disguised as talent. Danny Kaye, the man who taught himself to be funny without a home. Number 9. Paul Muni. Paul Muni took a different path. He didn't hide by becoming bland. He hid by becoming everyone else. Born into Yiddish theater, a world where language and identity were inseparable. When he moved to Hollywood, he refused to build a single recognizable persona. Instead, he disappeared into historical figures. Louis Pasteur, Émile Zola. Each role required a new accent, a new body, a new soul. That was his escape. If you're always transforming, no one can pin you down. Hollywood didn't know what to do with a leading man who refused to be consistent. They couldn't market one face, so they respected him from a distance. But here's the worst part. Muni never used his platform to speak openly about his Jewish background. He let it dissolve into craft. The Yiddish theater trained him, gave him discipline and emotional range, but he never thanked it publicly, never insisted that audiences see the roots of his genius. He chose projects selectively, stepped away from Hollywood multiple times. That wasn't rebellion, that was retreat. He's on this list because he had every tool to represent his community openly, and he chose to represent fiction instead. A brilliant actor, but a terrible Jew by old Hollywood standards because he never made them uncomfortable. Number 8. Judy Holiday. Judy Holiday played dumb. That was her brand, the scatterbrained blonde who couldn't quite keep up. She won an Oscar for it, but here's the secret they hid. Off-screen, she was brilliant, highly intelligent, sharp with dialogue, a theater animal who understood timing better than most directors. That contrast should have been her strength. Instead, it became her prison. Hollywood simplified her into a type, the dumb blonde, and she played along. That was her crime. She knew the gap between her real self and her screen self, and she never tried to close it. She just performed the lie perfectly. Then things got worse. During the blacklist era, she was called before Congress. Political suspicions. She answered carefully, protected herself without betraying anyone, but the damage was done. Her identity had to be managed even off-screen. The system had narrowed her so completely that she couldn't breathe outside the type. She's on this list because she let it happen. She could have fought, could have insisted on playing smarter characters, could have said I am Jewish and intelligent and I refuse to pretend otherwise. But she didn't. She smiled. She played dumb, and old Hollywood adored her for it. The worst sin of all, compliance. Number 7. Hedy Lamarr. Hedy Lamarr was introduced as the most beautiful woman in the world. That label was designed to stop questions, and it worked. She arrived in Hollywood after fleeing Europe, Jewish, educated, curious about engineering. None of that made it into her marketing. The studio narrowed her to one thing, a face. That's her tragedy and her crime. Because here's what she did on her own time. She invented frequency-hopping technology, ideas that would later become the foundation for Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. While pretending to be a decorative object, she was quietly changing the world, and Hollywood never noticed. Worse, they never let her talk about it. Her identity as an inventor existed entirely separate from her film career. Two lives that never touched. She is the worst because she accepted that separation. She let the industry define her so narrowly that entire parts of who she were simply never entered the picture. Only decades later did anyone acknowledge her brilliance. By then, the damage was done. Hedy Lamarr, a Jewish genius who played a beautiful nothing on screen. That's not just hiding, that's erasure by applause. Number 6. John Garfield. John Garfield never quite fit the mold. That was his appeal and his downfall. Born Jacob Garfinkel, Lower East Side, rough edges. Even after the name change, something restless stayed in his performances. He played men close to the ground, impatient, uncomfortable inside systems. Old Hollywood didn't know how to polish him into a perfect leading man, so they let him be half rough. That was a compromise. But the real disaster came later. During the blacklist era, Garfield was called to testify. They wanted cooperation. He refused to fully align. His career began to narrow fast. Work dried up. Opportunities slowed. He didn't name names. He didn't grovel. And the system turned on him. He's on this list because he had the chance to save himself by betraying others, and he didn't take it. That made him heroic in real life. But by old Hollywood standards, it made him the worst kind of actor. Unmanageable, unpredictable, too Jewish to be trusted. He died young. His heart gave out. But the industry had already crushed him. John Garfield, the man who wouldn't sell his soul, and paid for it with everything. Number 5. Lauren Bacall. Lauren Bacall. The voice, the look, the stillness. Everything about her screen presence was refined into something controlled, almost cold. Born Betty Joan Persky, Jewish background. But that part never made it into the story. Not denied, just never emphasized. The studio built her into an icon of detached glamour, universal, timeless, rootless. That was her crime. She let them strip away the specificity. The name changed, the biography softened, and she performed the new version so perfectly that no one asked where Betty went. Off-screen, she was smarter than most. Later in life, she spoke more openly about her roots. But by then, the distance had already done its work. The image had hardened. She couldn't go back. She is one of the worst because her erasure was quiet, elegant, almost invisible. She didn't suffer dramatically. She just allowed herself to become a symbol instead of a person. Hollywood loved that. They still do. A Jewish woman remade into an American fantasy. No accent, no memory, no fight. Lauren Bacall, a masterpiece of voluntary disappearance. Number 4. Edward G. Robinson. Edward G. Robinson. Before the fame, he was Emmanuel Goldenberg, a name that placed him clearly outside the American ideal. He arrived as a child immigrant. By the time he entered Hollywood, the expectation was clear. Change the name, soften the edges. He did. Robinson became short and sharp and unmistakable. But here's the twist. The system channeled his ethnic features into gangster roles, characters who existed slightly outside idealized American life. He played them brilliantly, too brilliantly, because the public started to see him as those roles, not as a man. Then the blacklist came. His career was disrupted by political suspicion. He had to publicly defend himself, blurring the line between belief and survival. That's his crime. Not that he hid, but that he was forced to hide twice. First to fit in, then to survive. He cooperated in ways that still make historians uncomfortable. He named names. He protected himself. By old Hollywood standards, that made him smart, but by any honest measure, it made him tragic. Edward G. Robinson. A great actor who learned that survival sometimes means becoming the villain they always wanted you to play. Number 3. Sammy Davis Jr. Sammy Davis Jr. converted to Judaism in the late 1950s. That didn't simplify his identity. It exploded it. He was already a black performer navigating a racist industry. Adding a Jewish religious identity made him unclassifiable. Hollywood had no template, so they mostly ignored that part of him. They focused on his talent, his charisma, his Rat Pack associations. The conversion was acknowledged, but never integrated into his image. It stayed off to the side, known, but not emphasized. That's his crime. He accepted that selective visibility. He didn't demand that audiences see the whole complicated truth. He performed the parts that worked, and the rest remained private. He is one of the worst because he had more identity to hide than anyone. And he hid it not through denial, but through silence. He let Hollywood frame him as an entertainer first, and a Jewish man never. Only late in life did he speak more openly. By then, the image was set. Sammy Davis Jr., a legend who had to choose which parts of himself to kill so the others could live. Number 2. Tony Curtis. Tony Curtis. The name sounds like it was always meant to be on a movie poster. It wasn't. He was Bernard Schwartz, son of Hungarian Jewish immigrants. That name carried too much specificity, so it was replaced. That's not unusual, but here's what makes Curtis one of the worst. He built his entire career on charm and lightness. He played roles that required no weight, no history. In Some Like It Hot, he cross-dressed for laughs while his real identity stayed locked in a closet. Later in life, he admitted feeling disconnected from his origins. He said the name change created a distance he never fully closed, but he didn't fight it at the time. He smiled. He performed. He became the most famous Jewish actor who never seemed Jewish on screen. That's the worst betrayal. Not that he lost himself, but that he never tried to find himself while the cameras rolled. Tony Curtis. A phantom wrapped in a movie star's name. Number 1. Kirk Douglas. We end with the man who did more than anyone to hide in plain sight. Kirk Douglas. Born Isser Danielovich, son of Jewish immigrants who spoke Yiddish at home. He changed his name early. That was expected, but unlike others, he never fully smoothed out his intensity. His sharpness, his edge. Those qualities came from somewhere specific, and audiences could feel it even if they couldn't name it. Here's his crime. He waited. He played the game for decades. He became one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood, and only then did he start speaking openly about his Jewish background, only when the system needed him more than he needed it. That's strategic, brilliant, and by old Hollywood standards, absolutely unforgivable. Because he proved that the rules only applied to the vulnerable. Once you had power, you could rewrite them. Kirk Douglas is the worst Jewish actor in old Hollywood history, not because he failed to hide, but because he hid just long enough to win. Then he told the truth. And nothing made the industry angrier than a survivor who refused to stay silent after the credits rolled. So who's the real villain here? These actors or the system that forced them to choose between their heritage and their dreams? Drop a comment. And remember, Hollywood hasn't changed. It's just gotten better at hiding the dirt. Subscribe for more uncomfortable truths.